Hello, everyone. Welcome to All Things Open. I'm super excited to be here. I haven't been to North Carolina in a really long time, but I am really excited to be here. I just came in yesterday, and I hope everyone else isn't too tired. I'm fighting off some serious jet lag right now, and drank definitely enough coffee for everyone in here, but I think we'll be able to make it through here, and hopefully you guys learned something a little bit today. Today we're going to talk about APIs and the developer experience behind them. I called this talk Time to First 200 OK, as we're going to talk a lot about how it's important and why it's important and some of the things you can do to make the developer experience when you're designing an API for your users in the best possible shape it can be. My name's Addison. I lead the developer relations team at a company called GitBook, where we focus on allowing you to publish documentation, whether it's product docs, API docs, technical docs. You can also write internal docs inside of there as well. All while integrated and being backed by Git. We have a booth also in the front, so feel free to stop by and say hi to me after this talk if you're interested in learning a little bit more. But the last couple years, I've spent a lot of time working on developing integration platforms, specifically APIs and SDKs. I helped launch a lot of the integration platforms at companies like Miro and Framer, if anyone's familiar with those tools before. And it's also what I'm doing right now at GitBook as well, and just thought it'd be nice to share some of the experiences that I've seen at some of these companies while we've been developing, documenting, and working on these APIs for users. So let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at what I want to talk about today. So I want to talk a little bit more about the abstract things when it comes to the developer experience for APIs, what APIs are in the modern day world and what that kind of means for us as developers when we're working on them, impact of API response time, the fundamentals of API design, how you can improve the developer experience, and we'll also eventually take a look at some real world case studies and examples as well. But not only do I want to talk a little bit about kind of the theory and the abstract things, I want to talk also about the practical things that you as a developer can implement into your APIs and development practices to also improve the development experience for, again, you as a developer, but also your users as they continue to use your APIs as well. So we'll talk about optimizing API performance, documentation, of course, errors, security considerations, and also things like security, or API testing and monitoring as well. So let's dive in. We'll have some time at the end as well for some questions. Hopefully, I timed it to have some questions at the end. But like I said, if not, feel free to come find me afterwards. Happy to talk to you all afterwards. So I want to start by talking about the importance of APIs in the modern world and how that applies to modern web applications. I think everyone here should be probably pretty familiar with APIs. If not, this will at least set some sort of baseline for everyone here moving forward for the rest of the talk. So what is an API and what makes it so important? Well, it basically allows you to communicate between two different pieces of software, and they allow you to increase things like the enhanced functionality, create integrations between two different pieces of software, and just improve efficiency through standardization as you continue to use an API. In the last couple of years, there's definitely been a pretty big mindset shift when coding and making products to an API-first development model, which is why it's more important than ever to focus on the API experience for the developers when they're using these in their day-to-day. So there's a lot of different examples of APIs in today's modern world. Again, outside of even the products that you're probably making today, a lot of us have probably used most of these today, whether it's your phone, a smart TV, or maybe even your smart fridge. I personally don't own a smart fridge, but maybe some of you do. But nearly every piece of modern day technology implements some use of an API to talk with the users or talk with other applications as well. Last week, I was in Melbourne at API Days, and I saw a slide from one of the other presenters from Postman, I think it was, with the statistics saying I think every modern application uses up to or more than 50 APIs in a modern application, which is, again, kind of proving the first point that I made, saying it's more important than ever to focus on the developer experience for these things in your own apps. And kind of, I thought this was funny off the refrigerator kind of theme. This guy even used the Samsung API to play a song every time his refrigerator is open. It's a pretty funny tweet and meme. Feel free to check it out. I'll also have a link to these slides after if you want to check these out as well. But outside of like the refrigerator API, and while a lot of this talk can be focused on more than just APIs, producing and coding and working on products as well, most of this talk is framed through the lens of working on web APIs and HTTP APIs. And a web API is basically allows your client applications to interact with the server application. It sets rules on how requests and responses are handled and exchanged, so that different pieces of software can navigate and work together efficiently. So again, we're going to focus on just this sort of APIs, but a lot of these higher level concepts that I'll talk about can be applied to software development much more than, again, just the lens of this specific talk. But let's set some baselines with the API response times and why this is going to be important as you're working on them in general. So this is a graph that I just made and kind of found, and I'll back it up with some of the sources that I found afterwards. But to set some baselines, 100 milliseconds is considered excellent for a web API. Anywhere between 100 and 200 milliseconds can be considered good. But around 5 seconds, the user is going to feel a significant delay and will probably abandon your application as a result. For a lot of real-time applications like gaming and e-commerce, maybe trading apps, this should be the maximum acceptable baseline for an API as it's working. There are some caveats to that, which I'll mention in a bit, but I wanted to pull off this tweet, which mentions a quote from Paul, one of the Gmail creators, and it states that interactions should be faster than 100 milliseconds. And the reason is because 100 milliseconds for a user is when interactions feel instantaneous. And if you start to think about it, when you use different products and use APIs, it should feel instantaneous because that's when your users aren't going to notice any lag, and it's going to feel like a smooth experience. This is one of the principles that the Superhuman team, which is another email client, has been implementing into their own product, not only their APIs. And I think it's a pretty cool baseline, not only for products, but specifically APIs moving forward. So again, these different timelines should be set as a baseline for your APIs. Now, there are also, of course, caveats to that. Things like if you have to upload a different file, or processes where you have to process data, those are obviously going to take longer than 100 milliseconds, and your users are going to expect that. So you don't have to worry about it so much for this, but for a lot of UI interactions where users are going to expect some sort of response from it, 100 milliseconds should be the baseline. But outside of just how fast it is, what else can make a good API? What are some of the characteristics and the fundamentals behind some of the best APIs that are out there? Predictability is a huge one. And this comes down to more than just these two, but these two I'm going to highlight right away, which is the naming and the versioning. And the more predictable your API is, the easier it's going to be able to be used by users. There's going to be a reduced number of errors for yourself when you code them, but also for your users as they use them, and hopefully lead to a higher adoption of the APIs that you are creating. And again, some of the ways that you can do this is with the naming. Take a look at some of the other APIs that you use, and you'll notice that most of them are pretty predictable in terms of the way that they're named, using plurals for collections, singular for resources, or verb noun for actions. I'm also not saying that this is a hard rule, but if you take a look at most of the industry and how they name a lot of their APIs, you are going to start to notice some patterns like this. Other things like versioning as well with V1, V2 can also be applied to this kind of concept too. The other thing that you might want to do is standardize your APIs as well. I also thought this would be kind of a funny one to put in because it's almost Halloween as well. JSON is the most widely accepted format for responses on the web and for APIs. It's human readable, it's easy to parse, making it really standard for developing web APIs specifically. You also see probably XML out there, and maybe you use it in your own applications. But given JSON is already compatible with most of the web, it should be the standard for the way that you're producing these different web APIs. I also recommend everyone to reread or read for the first time the Swagger Resource Hub. They have a lot of great posts on there on a lot of the standardization of APIs. There's a lot of great resources that they make specifically that have inspired a lot of this, but also that I use in my day-to-day as well. But we can also talk about the optimization of APIs as well. So how can they become more performant on an actual technical level? And there are a few things that I want to talk about in terms of how can we help get our APIs under 100 milliseconds from a response time. And it comes down to a lot of the way that you organize your database. The first one I'd mention is probably efficient database queries and smart indexing of your database itself. So making sure that the data that you put in your database actually makes sense to you as a user. Start to think about it down the line on how you might want to use this data. And make it make sense, essentially. You can optimize your SQL queries as well. So use indexing, try to avoid as many unnecessary joins as possible. Again, kind of planning out your database structure well in advance to optimize your query structures. Implement things like connection pooling, so reuse database connections. A lot of tools out here as well that you might use to call APIs and send requests, and will implement a lot of this already. So a lot of this stuff isn't something that you might not have to think about so seriously, but they are worth mentioning if you are working in the space as well. And use things like eager loading or batch queries to reduce the number of database calls. But with the API itself, you can do things like in-memory caching, so cache data that is frequently accessed, use database query caching, so kind of cache the queries as well, and API response caching, so cache the response. Basically cache as much as possible when and where it makes sense. And again, a lot of tools out there implements a lot of this for you right out of the box, but they are, again, worth mentioning on how they can help your APIs become as fast as possible. But the developer experience of using an API goes much past how fast it is or how easy it is to be able to be implemented. It's how easy it is to be used. So let's take a look at how you can basically make this a lot easier for your users as they continue to use your API and adopt it. The first thing that I want to mention is adding an SDK or a library that might sit on top of your REST API. An SDK is a software development kit, and it basically allows you to call your API, your REST API, in a language-specific framework. So as an example, we have an integration platform in GitBook that lets you create integrations and actual blocks inside of the GitBook editor. And our API is just a REST API, but we've developed TypeScript SDK that allows you to build these apps that calls these APIs without you having to think about a lot of these extra elements and makes it a lot easier to use. A lot of times these are also going to help your users stay up to date with the different versions and updates that are going to be made. So making sure you can start to think about where are my APIs going to be used, and does it make sense for me to create an extra framework or an extra library that'll make it easier for them to adopt it. These are just, again, 3 of the more popular libraries for front-end development. And this might not be applicable to you, but just thinking about it in this lens is also going to, again, make it easier for others to use your API in the first place. The second thing I'd highly recommend in this lens is crafting examples and or starter kits. This was one of the main things that I was put in charge of at Miro when I first started, as we had launched a new API platform and no one had really used it. We had a few beta and early access testers, but we didn't have a lot of knowledge on what users wanted to build. So we spent a lot of time researching what are some of the potential things that you can build, and built a ton of different boilerplates that are really easy for you to clone or use as a kind of starting point as inspiration for your own project. And creating this, I would say, was one of the higher kind of value things that we did to help people adopt the API platform as a whole. Because it gave people inspiration on what they could build and how to do certain things. And we wrote tons of different guides and tons of different materials that were backed on the code that we wrote on how they would actually function. So I would highly recommend to do this. Specifically if you're working on an integration platform, but it also would apply to you if you want people to use your API outside of just within your own app. Don't forget about the smaller bits of your API as well. So this kind of is a kind of shout back to some of the standardization aspect of it. But make sure that it just makes sense to your users. Again, take a look at the industry standards around you and make it make sense to yourself and make it make sense to the developers that you're working with, even on the APIs next to you. So thinking about the smaller things like pagination, when you're authenticating users and when you're returning large sets of data, it doesn't hurt to take a look at the other APIs that you've used and use that as inspiration or a starting point on what you should do for your own. This is also another thing that we focused a lot on at Miro, but building developer trust through a deprecation strategy. This is one thing as well that I also see a lot of teams overlooking or kind of putting off to the back, which I think it should be definitely at the forefront. But your product and business needs are always going to be changing, which in turn is going to make your product be changing. And it's almost inevitable for your API to change at some point. And leaving that thought off until the end is something that's going to hurt you and your developers down the line. Maybe a show of hands, whoever's worked with an API that had suddenly changed and you had to go back and fix something later on. Yeah, it's not really fun when you wake up on Monday and nothing's working. So basically making sure that your deprecation strategy is clear and it builds developer trust. If developers aren't going to trust your product, you can't trust them to continue using it with you. And I think the deprecation strategy is one of the bigger ways that you can start to foster and build developer trust through that. And it could be as simple as saying, leaving a note at the top of the doc saying this is subject to change. Even a small note like that will at least instill some sorts of confidence in the developers using it that, well, it might change in the future. And another thing, make sure you document the hell out of your APIs. You might have guessed I was going to say something about documentation, working at a documentation company. Also, when I was at API Days last week, his name was Jordan Walsh. He was the developer advocate at Postman. He had some great insights from one of the most recent developer surveys. And it was saying one of the biggest challenges for developers is documentation being out of date, which I'm sure a lot of us in here can relate to as well. But it's a lot of the small pieces about documenting your APIs that I think a lot of people overlook or forget about that are the biggest pieces that are going to help instill a lot of confidence and bring a lot of trust to your developers, which is why I want to talk about that a little bit next, is like, what are some of the best practices for API documentation and what can you implement now that's going to help you down the line? This is also from the developer survey this year from Stack Overflow, but it's basically the technical documentation preferences on how you want to learn to code. And if you take a look, 90% of people who responded say that the API documentation is the first things that they'll go to, next being user guides or README files, and then the rest of them kind of going down. But 90% and 77% are directly related to going to the docs, and if they're not up to date or don't contain the right information, you're already losing a lot of trust in your developers that are using your APIs. So yeah, adding things like an API testing suite to your docs as well should probably be a requirement. There's a lot of great solutions out there for people to test your APIs. But again, making sure it's just at least easy and up to date is going to be one of the most kind of important things that you can do. The more interactive you can make it, the better. Thinking about authentication is another big thing, specifically within the docs as well. I'm going to say this a lot, and I have been as well throughout this talk, but basically make it as easy as possible for someone to head to your docs and get started and send their first API call within seconds if possible. One of the bigger roadblocks to this is going to be authentication, and your API probably should be behind an authentication wall. But there's a lot of different things to think about. Do you use a platform that allows users to authenticate through their docs directly? Is there a way that they can work with test data if they aren't able to generate a token or use a token directly? Are there ways for them to send test calls right off the bat as well, right from the docs? Again, thinking about these things are going to make your developers' lives a lot easier. And I'll revisit this a little bit later, but I think Stripe does a really great job at this. And there's also a lot of other companies and tools out there too that allow you to sign in with your account and get developer tokens right from within the docs, which make it really personalized, which is another theme we'll touch on in just a bit. But with your docs as well, they should not only contain up-to-date and accurate information, but they should be human readable as well, so that even non-technical people can head to your docs and understand what's going on. One thing, and why I put this on here as well, this is a part of GitBook, and what you'll see in a lot of docs platforms as well, which is going to, I think, change a lot of the way that people are writing or at least interacting with docs, is even if your docs aren't human readable, there's going to be a lot of ways and a lot of changes that make your docs human searchable. And a lot of platforms have things like AI agents or AI search within it that make it really easy for them to find the information right from just like the search bar. But this goes back to one of the things that I was saying before. If your docs aren't up to date, then you can't trust this to be right in any way, shape, or form. Moving on, I want to also then talk about handling errors and responses, because within your APIs, errors are bound to happen, whether it's with your visitors who are using your APIs, or if it's with you as a developer and you're needing to implement error response handling. It's bound to happen, but what really matters is how you as a developer handle them. It'll give clear instructions, hopefully, to the person who's receiving the error on what to do and hopefully how to resolve it. There is a standard that's been produced for this, and it's called Problem Details. Swagger also has a lot of, they have a lot of resources on learning more about this, but essentially it should include things like a type, a title, status, detail, and the instance of where this happened as a baseline, so you can very easily know what went wrong and where to find more information on it if needed. But the error messages can also be further refined with a lot of information to help developers find out what also went wrong. And I think this is a pretty good example from Stripe that gives a lot of context on what went wrong. And there's a few pieces I want to highlight specifically. Non-sensitive information that can be highly identifiable, so the customer ID that you see here. Documentation URL, so right away someone could head to the docs and find out how they can resolve it themselves. And even a suggestion on how to resolve the error right from there. And that could be already just pulled from the docs. But as a developer, if you're running into an error and you see this is already a lot more helpful than just the standard 404 not found or 400 not working. And also, as, again, someone who's maintaining or working on the API, make it easy for yourself to debug these errors too. So definitely set up logging within your API calls, make it easy for you to find the different things that are going wrong, how you can resolve them, and make it easy. Because most of the times, it's not as simple as just one API call going wrong. It's probably a series of different things that go wrong. So finding out where in the stack trace things have exploded, that's going to help you debug things a lot easier. And again, I'm going to talk about documentation a lot more throughout this talk as well. But also document your errors as well. So kind of going back to the link to the documentation in the error code itself, it's probably a good idea to have a section on errors, on really common things. And one of the more common things that I see is the, again, the authentication kind of aspect of it. And this is another thing that we worked on at Miro, but it's basically just a guide on how to authenticate it and what the most common error response codes that you probably would see as a developer, how to fix it. And if you take a look at docs for a lot of APIs, you'll probably find a section of this now. So it's important to probably implement it for your own tools and your own APIs as well. So I want to just quickly highlight towards the end here a few case studies and some real-world examples of, again, some API documents and documentation and experiences that I've used in the past and I like to use as inspiration. The first one being MailChimp. But the cool part about their APIs that I like the most is specifically their organization of their docs and what you see on the side. So you see the overview, you see the guides, you see the docs on the API, and you see the API reference as well. And each one of these is going to provide a very specific kind of reason and answer specific questions for a user who might be visiting the docs. The overview will obviously give an overview of the docs and what this is good for. The guides, this highlights a lot of the things that I was mentioning before and what we had focused on at Miro. So examples, user kits, starting points, but also things like error handling, etc. You have documentation, which is going to be a really good place for things like getting started, and then obviously the API reference as well, which most likely you're probably using a standard like Swagger or Open API, and a lot of this can be already generated and will have a lot of the information that you might just need to list and use and show here, like your requests examples, and just any query parameters or just any information related to this here. The second one that I want to talk about is Stripe. Show of hands, has anyone here used or currently used the Stripe API or had gone to their docs? It's pretty well known that Stripe has actually invested a lot of time and money into their developer experience and their docs specifically, which is why I like to use it as an example, because I think it implements most of the things that I've gone through today all in one package. They're consistent, they're very much developer focused and easy to understand. Like I said, they realized that their main end users are the developers implementing these APIs, so it's worth their time and money to spend a little bit extra time focusing on how to make that as easy as possible and enjoyable to increase the adoption of this. And there are a few different things with their docs that I want to point out that make it really useful. So the first one is you have examples. So you have the download the full app example, and you also have a lot of different SDKs or libraries that you can download and choose from to take a look at if you're using a different type of framework. You can also toggle between some of the biggest kind of use cases on the left-hand side between working with payment links, the checkout API, and then a lot of the specific sections inside of there. In the upper right-hand corner, as I mentioned before, you're able to authenticate yourself, which will customize this whole experience. But all in all, you should be able to head here and understand everything that's possible with the Stripe API, and hopefully leave this with a working app or at least a working knowledge of this. And like I said, you even are able to download the full app, which makes it really, really nice for a user, because you don't have to wonder how this fits into your app if you have something that's working right off the bat. And I realize that this is probably a bit of a stretch for most teams to leave and code up tomorrow. But again, it's dissecting a lot of these different pieces that I've been kind of talking about the last 30 minutes that are going to be helpful for you as you continue to work on APIs that are going to be important to think about. So I want to wrap up and give, again, some points that if you leave away with 4 things, what can you leave here with? The first one is the 100 milliseconds rule of thumb and baseline, and some of the different things that I've talked about that make it possible to get 100 millisecond baseline for your response time. The second one, obviously, docs. Don't skip out on this, and if you want to talk docs, come find me after this. Happy to talk about it. The third one is keeping it standard. Make it easy and make it make sense for your APIs. And the fourth one is docs. The fourth one is actually being your own user. So you, at the end of the day, use APIs instead of building APIs all day. You also use them. So be yourself and be your own user. And more often than not, that's going to help you with a lot of the decisions that you make as you continue to build APIs. 100 milliseconds, keep it standard, docs, and be your own user. That's all I had for today, though, on the DevX of building APIs. Again, my name's Addison. If you want to take a look at the slides, again, you can find them here. Or feel free to say hi to me at our booth. We'll be here tomorrow as well. And also tomorrow, I forget exactly what time, I'm going to be giving a workshop on GitBook specifically. So even if you don't have time today and want to stop in and see a lot of the inner workings and some of the more technical parts, we'll be doing that tomorrow. Other than that, thank you all for joining.